London, 1892. The gas lamps flicker along Piccadilly, their glow casting golden halos over rain-slick cobblestones. Carriages rattle past gentlemen in top hats and women draped in silk, a city intoxicated by progress, money and appearances. And at its very center stands a man who seems to command the entire performance, Oscar Wilde. He enters the salon like a burst of sunlight, laughter trailing in his wake. He speaks and the room bends toward him, captivated, bewitched. Every word from his lips sounds rehearsed and divine, as though he is performing for the gods of wit themselves. He wears his fame like a costume, velvet coat, carnation on his lapel, eyes bright with irony. To the world, Wilde is more than a playwright. He is a phenomenon, the voice of decadence and intellect, a man who makes beauty his religion and conversation his stage. His plays fill theaters, his essays fill newspapers, and his epigrams fill the air of every drawing room in London. He once wrote, "To live is the rarest thing in the world." Most people exist, that is all. And indeed, Wilde is determined to live, to feel, to love, to burn brightly, even if it consumes him. Yet behind the glitter, a shadow follows. He knows it, feels it in the way some men sneer when he passes. The whispers that follow after applause fades. The same society that adores his genius also despises his defiance. For Wilde does not fit neatly into their expectations of manhood, morality, or decorum. He mocks them, their hypocrisy, their prudishness, their hunger for scandal disguised as virtue. He lives too honestly for a world built on lies. At home, in his candlelit study, surrounded by books and lilies, Wilde writes about the duality of human nature. In The Picture of Dorian Gray, he gives life to a man who hides his sins behind beauty, a mirror of the society that hides its rot behind manners. It is brilliant, provocative, and dangerous. Critics call it immoral, obscene, and Wilde, ever the provocateur, replies, "There is no such thing as a moral or an immoral book. Books are well written or badly written. That is all. But beneath the defiance, something more tender lives, a heart that yearns for love, not applause." In a smoky room at the Café Royal, Wilde's eyes meet those of a young poet, Lord Alfred Douglas. Golden-haired, charming, reckless, Bosie, as friends call him. To Wilde, he is youth incarnate, beauty, poetry, and danger all in one. Their connection is immediate, electric. It is a spark that will ignite the greatest love and the greatest tragedy of Wilde's life. The rain outside continues to fall, soft against the glass, as London hums with carriages and laughter. Wilde does not yet know that this love will destroy him, that the same wit that crowned him will become the rope that hangs him, that the glittering city that applauds him now will one day cast him out. But for now, in this fleeting, fragile moment, he is invincible. He is the master of language, the prince of paradox, the artist who made the world his stage. And like every tragic hero, he cannot yet see the curtain beginning to close. Fame is a fickle friend. One moment it crowns you in light, the next it exposes your every shadow. For Oscar Wilde, the applause of London grows louder, but so too do the whispers. They call him decadent, immoral, unnatural. But Wilde, proud and fearless, wears scandal as if it were a flower on his lapel. He has never hidden who he is. He writes of beauty, of truth, of love, even love that dares not speak its name. In Lord Alfred Douglas, Wilde finds a mirror for his soul, a wild, beautiful thing that society tells him to deny. Bosie is reckless, arrogant, and young, but he loves Wilde with the fire of rebellion. Together they stroll through Hyde Park, dine in candlelit restaurants, exchange letters so tender they could melt marble. Each word between them is both a blessing and a sin. But in Victorian England, love between men is not love. It is a crime, a sin against nature, punishable by ruin. And though Wilde knows the danger, he cannot resist. To deny love for him is to deny life itself. Soon, their affair becomes the subject of gossip in the papers, whispered among London's high society. The same people who once recited Wilde's witty lines at dinner parties now raise their eyebrows in judgment. Bosie's father, John Sholto Douglas, the Marquis of Queensberry, burns with rage and humiliation. He sees Wilde not as a man but as a corrupter, a devil who has seduced his son into shame. And he vows to destroy him. In the winter of 1894, Queensberry storms into the Albemarle Club, leaving a calling card addressed to Oscar Wilde, posing as a sodomite. A misspelling, but a death sentence all the same. It is a public accusation, one that cannot be ignored. Friends beg Wilde to flee. They tell him to burn the card, to leave England to protect his art and his freedom. But Wilde's pride, the same pride that built his legend, blinds him. He refuses to be shamed by a brute. He will not let the world define love as filth. And so, against all reason, he sues the Marquess for libel. It is a fatal decision. The courtroom becomes a stage, and Wilde, as ever, performs. He wears his elegance like armor, his wit like a sword. When the prosecutor asks him whether he kissed a man, Wilde replies coolly, "Oh no, it was far too beautiful for that." Laughter ripples through the gallery, but beneath the laughter danger lurks. His words, once his gift, now betray him. The libel case collapses. Evidence of Wilde's indecency, letters, witnesses, lovers, begins to surface. And within days the tables turn. Wilde, once the accuser, becomes the accused. He is charged under the Labouchere Amendment, the law against gross indecency between men. Bailiffs storm his hotel. His name vanishes from theatre posters. His plays are shut down, his friends disappear. The laughter of London that once adored him now echoes with mockery. He hides for a time, in a friend's house, then a hotel under an assumed name. But he cannot stay hidden. The police come for him at the Cadogan Hotel. As he's led away, one witness recalls his calm dignity. The poet who once dined with princes, now carried off by constables in front of jeering crowds. At Holloway Prison, Wilde's rings are taken, his clothes stripped, his head shaved. The world that worshipped him has turned to stone. The newspapers call him a monster. The public, once dazzled by his brilliance, now devours his ruin. In the darkness of his cell, Wilde writes to Bosie, letters filled with heartbreak and clarity. He calls it De Profundis, from the depths. It is no longer the voice of a dandy or a performer, but of a man who has seen the cost of living too truthfully in a hypocritical world. He writes, "Suffering is one very long moment. We cannot divide it by seasons. We can only record its moods. The laughter that once defined him is gone. All that remains is the silence of a man who has been stripped of everything, fame, fortune, love, and dignity. But somewhere in that silence, a new truth begins to form. Wilde starts to understand that perhaps the tragedy of his life is not that society destroyed him, but that he believed for too long it could ever accept him. There is a sound that haunts a man more than any jeer or insult, the sound of a door closing behind him, echoing on cold stone. For Oscar Wilde, that sound meant the end of the world. Inside Reading Jail, the wit of London became prisoner C33. Gone were the silk waistcoats, the silver-tipped canes, the champagne laughter. Now he wore coarse prison cloth and carried a bucket through silent corridors. Each morning began not with words, but with labor, dragging a wheelbarrow, breaking stones, marching in endless circles beneath a grey, indifferent sky. They called it penal servitude. But what it truly was annihilation. For 23 hours a day, silence was absolute. Prisoners could not speak, could not look at each other, could not exist beyond the measured beat of footsteps and the hiss of keys. The man who once made the world tremble with his sentences was forbidden even to whisper. His mind, deprived of sound and color, began to unravel. And yet, Wilde endured. He watched sparrows flutter against the barred windows and saw beauty even in their brief despair. He found poetry in the rhythm of chains, in the shadow of suffering. He wrote later that it was in prison that he finally learned what sorrow meant. One day during chapel he saw a boy sentenced to death, a soldier who had killed his wife. The sight of that trembling young man broke something in him. From that moment, Wilde ceased to think of punishment and began to think of mercy. He understood, perhaps for the first time, that beneath every mask of sin was a soul yearning simply to be loved. And when the day of release finally came, May 1897, he stepped out into the world a ghost. His body was frail, his health ruined. He was only 42, yet looked far older. London, once his stage, had forgotten him. His plays no longer ran. His books were banned. His name, once written in gold, was now shorthand for disgrace. He left England quietly and crossed the Channel to France, where no one cared who he had been. In Dieppe, he took the name Sebastian Melmoth, after the doomed wanderer of Gothic fiction. It was a name born of irony and exile. He rented small rooms in cheap hotels, drifting between Paris, Naples, and the Riviera. He lived on borrowed money, kindness, and memory. Bosie returned to him for a time, a brief, bitter reunion, but their love, once electric, had burned itself into ash. They argued, reconciled, and separated once more. Wilde would write later, "It was a love that dared not speak its name and should not have shouted so loud. But even in exile, even in disgrace, his mind still burned." He wrote The Ballad of Reading Gaol, a poem so raw, so filled with compassion, that the very society that condemned him could not ignore its beauty. He signed it only C33 at his prison number, as if to say the man named Oscar Wilde was dead. But the voice of his suffering had survived. In cafes, he told stories to strangers who did not recognize the legend before them. He drank absinthe, laughed too loudly, wept too easily. He still wore flowers in his lapel, though now they were wilted. He joked that he was dying beyond his means. Behind each quip was an ache too deep to measure, and yet there was grace in his ruin. He began to forgive the judges, the jailers, even the world that had destroyed him. In a letter near the end of his life, he wrote, "The gods had given me almost everything, but I let myself be lured into long spells of senseless and sensual ease. Tired of being on the heights, I deliberately went to the depths." He saw his tragedy not as injustice, but as revelation. To suffer, he said, was to know the soul. To be broken, to lose everything, was to finally see what endures. By the time autumn fell over Paris in 1900, Wilde's body was failing. He was penniless, often ill, moving from one cheap hotel to another. Still, he entertained the waiters, amused the guests, made even the shadows laugh. For in Wilde's world, even death had to be stylish. When a friend asked him if he still believed in God, Wilde smiled faintly and whispered, "No, but I fear he may believe in me." It was a confession not of faith, but of fatigue, as in a poet's final irony. The laughter, the brilliance, the scandal, all had faded. Only the silence remained. But within that silence, Wilde had discovered something purer than applause or fame, the strange redemptive beauty of suffering. Paris, 1900. The city was alive with light and laughter. Cafes spilling over with talk of art, love, revolution. But somewhere in the quiet backstreets of the left bank, behind a faded hotel sign that read L'Hotel, lay a man forgotten by time. He was once the brightest star in London's sky. Now he slept on a creaking bed beneath peeling wallpaper, surrounded by silence and unpaid bills. Oscar Wilde was dying. The room was small, narrow, dimly lit, and heavy with the smell of illness and absinthe. His furniture was mismatched, his possessions few. A crucifix hung above the bed, not from faith but from a kind of poetic resignation. He once joked that his wallpaper was killing him, and that one of them would have to go. It was Wilde's final battle, beauty versus decay, art against oblivion. The doctors called it meningitis, though the cause was more complicated: years of neglect, poverty, and the radiation of grief that never stopped burning inside him. His friends came and went, bringing bottles, laughter, and sometimes tears. But mostly he was alone. The man who once conquered London's salons now survived on the pity of strangers. And yet, he remained Wilde. When a priest entered to offer him confession, Wilde looked up with his old mischievous glint. "My dear father," he whispered, "I'm afraid I am dying beyond my means." Even as death tightened its grip, his wit refused to surrender. It was not vanity, it was defiance. Humor had always been his armor, his rebellion against despair. Outside his window, Paris was alive, the clatter of carriages, the smell of bread, the laughter of children. Life went on indifferent and radiant as Wilde faded quietly into the background. He had once declared, "Life imitates art far more than art imitates life." Now, his life had become the purest tragic art of all. In his final months, he was sustained by two visitors, Reginald Turner, his faithful friend, and Robert Ross, his loyal editor and companion. They brought him books, a little money, and sometimes hope. Ross, the man who had once defended him through scandal and exile, arranged for Wilde to be received into the Catholic Church before death. Wilde, ever the aesthete, accepted not as an act of belief but of beauty. He wanted, he said, the last ceremony, as it suits the end of a romantic. He spoke often of forgiveness, not of others. but of himself. He wrote that he had lived for pleasure, but found meaning only in pain. He no longer cursed his downfall. He saw in it a strange mercy. Where there is suffering, he said, there is holy ground. By late November, his body was failing rapidly. He could no longer stand, and his laughter had become a whisper. But even then, when a friend asked if he feared death, he smiled faintly and murmured, "My wallpaper and I are fighting a duel to the death. One of us has to go." He died on November 30th, 1900 at the age of 46. The priest performed the last rites by candlelight. There was no family, no ceremony, no flowers, only Ross and Turner by his side. As dawn broke over Paris, the world lost its most flamboyant rebel, and perhaps its most human one. His body was laid to rest in a modest grave at Bagneux Cemetery, marked only by a number. The newspapers barely noticed. England did not mourn. The empire that had once cheered his plays had erased his name from its stages. But time, as always, is the final editor. 2 decades later, Wilde's ashes were moved to Père Lachaise Cemetery, beneath a soaring stone angel, a sculpture so bold it was nearly censored for its beauty. There, among poets and dreamers, he found the immortality that life had denied him. On his tomb are carved his own words, "And alien tears will fill for him. Pity's long broken urn, for his mourners will be outcast men. And outcasts always mourn, and indeed the outcast did mourn him. The lonely, the misunderstood, the lovers condemned by their own times. They found in Wilde not scandal but sanctuary. His words, once ridiculed, became scripture for those who dared to be themselves. From the underground bars of post-war London to the pride parades a century later, Wilde's ghost walked, laughing, defiant, eternal. For all his tragedy, Oscar Wilde had triumphed. Not through wealth or fame, but through art, the one thing even death could not silence. His plays returned to the stage, his wit quoted by kings and scholars alike. The man who was destroyed by hypocrisy became its greatest mirror. And as the decades passed, the world that condemned him slowly learned to understand him. His life became a parable, not of shame, but of courage. A reminder that genius is not about perfection, but persistence. That truth, however dangerous, must be spoken, even if it costs everything. In the end, Wilde's tragedy was also his victory, for he revealed a truth that still stings today, that society loves beauty until it becomes inconvenient, and celebrates truth only when it no longer threatens comfort. Yet through laughter, ruin and death, he remained what he had always been, a poet of paradoxes, a lover of life, and a man too vivid for the dull cruelty of his age. In the end, time, the great and patient sculptor, carved Wilde's name back into the marble of history. What society once buried in shame, it now remembers with reverence. What was once scandal has become scripture. What was once exile has become immortality. His words survived the flames of ridicule and the silence of death. They wandered through the years, whispered in classrooms, quoted in theaters, printed in books that outlived every judge and every law that once condemned him. It was as if truth itself refused to die. Long after his death, the world began to see the tragedy of Oscar Wilde for what it truly was, not the fall of a sinner, but the crucifixion of a man too honest for his age. He had written about masks, about the price of beauty and the cost of love, never realizing that his life would become the perfect example of them all. He had not merely lived art, he had become it. In the streets of Dublin, statues now stand in his honor, surrounded by flowers and laughter. In London, his plays are revived on the very stages that once banned his name. And in Paris, at Père Lachaise, his tomb is covered with lipstick kisses, tokens of gratitude from strangers who never met him, but who somehow know him still. Each kiss is a silent apology from a world that once turned its back, but perhaps Wilde himself foresaw it. He once said, "Every saint has a past and every sinner has a future." He believed redemption was not granted by society, but earned through understanding. And in that sense, Wilde's story became a mirror for us all, a reflection of how cruelty is often born of fear, and how the punishment of truth-tellers reveals more about the world than about them. His legacy is not only in words, but in courage. For every artist who dares to speak what others fear, for every soul who lives in defiance of convention, for every person punished for love, Oscar Wilde still walks beside them. He reminds us that beauty in its truest form is rebellion, that laughter can be resistance, that art, no matter how fragile, endures longer than judgment, and perhaps that is the secret of his immortality. He was destroyed, yes, but not defeated, because his downfall became his resurrection. Through disgrace, he discovered truth. Through pain, he revealed beauty. And through death, he taught the world that the only real sin is hypocrisy. Now, when we read his words, when we laugh at his wit or feel the ache in his poetry, we are reminded that greatness often comes wrapped in ruin, and that even a broken heart can illuminate the world. So when the candle of Oscar Wilde finally burned out in that dim Paris room, it did not end, it transformed. It became a quiet, flickering light that still glows in every artist, every dreamer, every soul who refuses to bow to the cruelty of conformity. In life, he was mocked for his difference. In death, he became a symbol of truth's endurance, for the world may crucify its poets, but in the end, it is their words that outlive empires. And as long as humanity longs for beauty, laughter and love without shame, the spirit of Oscar Wilde will never die.